one of the joint chairs of the Socialist History Society. So welcome everybody. We're very pleased to have Kate Connelly speaking to us on her new book on a suffragette in America, basically a study of Sylvia Pankhurst, a commentary and letters and articles that Sylvia Pankhurst wrote in relation to her visits to Americas. Kate has previously published a biography of Sylvia Pankhurst, and she'll no doubt talk to us later about other things that she may be working on. She's spoken at Society on a number of occasions, once at the Bishopsgate, which must be three years ago or so, but also at one of the University of East Anglia Socialist History conferences, which are sponsored by the Socialist History Society. She's known, and her works are known to many of us. Just one thing before Kate speaks. I'll say something about the Socialist History Society and our next events after the question and discussion session, but we just needed to remember Stan Newens, our president, who died a few weeks ago, in fact, since our last meeting. Stan was very involved in the Socialist History Society, chaired and spoke at many of our meetings, and was well known not just as a politician, but as somebody very committed to socialist history and very active in socialist history networks, both nationally and locally. So it's very sad to lose Stan. Some of us got to know him quite well over the years. Sort of our condolences, obviously, to his family. Some people I know listened in because they couldn't attend the funeral, but there were obviously a number of sort of contributions about his activity, and there is an obituary I drafted for the Society, which is in the latest newsletter, which is on its way to you. But we'll talk more about, as I say, the newsletter and our other publications after the talk. There will, of course, be time for questions and discussions, but could I ask you all to mute yourselves while Kate is speaking? You can put questions in chat, or once Kate is finished, use the hands up system, which varies, I know, depending on what type of Zoom you've got. So that's all from me. Over to Kate. Welcome.
Thank you very, very much, Duncan. And I would also like to offer my condolences to everybody that knew Stan. I'm absolutely delighted to come and speak here today. It's really nice to be able to do an event again. So thank you very, very much to the Socialist History Society for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you some images as I talk. Hopefully that has worked. And I'm going to talk today about Sylvia Pankhurst's lecture tours of North America, their place in suffrage history, and the manuscript that she wrote about America. She wrote 8 chapters of a book about the United States, which was unpublished until 2019. It lay in the archives, and I published it, edited it and published it in 2019. So I will talk a bit about why I think that manuscript is so special and so important. And I'll finish my talk by reading a little bit from it so that you get the sense of the very beautiful piece of writing that it is. Now, there we are. So here's Sylvia Pankhurst. She's on the right of the screen, here together with her mother on the left of the screen, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her older sister, Christabel Pankhurst. Emmeline and Christabel, as I'm sure most people here will know, were founders of the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. An organization that campaigned for women's right to vote and distinguished itself really by using direct action and civil disobedience as part of its tactics to try and win women's suffrage. Sylvia Pankhurst, who you can see on the screen, was an active member of the organization, and at the time that she went to America in 1911, she had been imprisoned for her role in the campaign on 2 separate occasions. So she was a suffragette activist, but by 1911, she had grown increasingly unhappy with the elitist direction that the Women's Social and Political Union was going in. An elitist direction that argued that it was the duty of wealthier, more privileged women in society to do the campaigning on behalf of, as it was put, their poorer sisters. The argument was made by Emmeline and Christabel and a number of the other leading activists that working women's lives were too hard, they were not educated well enough to be able to lead the campaign. Sylvia Pankhurst, of course, as a socialist, found this a very, very difficult thing to accept, and she had her private disagreements, but she kept those disagreements private. She did so for a number of reasons. It was, of course, a very difficult situation. This was an organization founded by her family members, but also she didn't really know how she could make those criticisms without undermining the cause, and she very much didn't want to undermine in any way those activists whose heroism, personal heroism, and the sacrifices they were undertaking, being sent to prison, women being force-fed, so on and so forth. She didn't want in any way to undermine them. But her disagreements were known by her family members, at least, and they were quite keen to keep Sylvia Pankhurst on the sidelines of the campaign. One of the things they did to that end was to commission her to write a history of the militant suffragette movement. And this meant, because she suddenly had a book deadline to meet, that she couldn't get arrested anymore and she couldn't go to prison, which was, of course, one way for a suffragette's profile to be raised. So she was kept out of the limelight for a number of years while she was writing this book. When she completed her history of the campaign, which was very loyal and didn't, again, articulate any of her own criticisms of their strategy, they then decided that she should go on book tours and promote this book, very far away indeed. And they decided that she should go and promote the history all the way over in North America. So Sylvia Pankhurst went to North America on 2 separate occasions. This is a sort of promotional brochure from one of those tours. This is in the Library of Congress in Washington, DC. She went on 2 separate occasions. She went in 1911 for the first 3 months of that year, and then she went the following year for the first 3 months of 1912. And these were incredibly extensive tours. She went to 19 different states in the United States, and in addition, Washington, DC. And she also went up into Canada. This required a huge amount of energy. She spoke once, twice, sometimes 3 times a day. Sometimes she was speaking to audiences of thousands of people, very often in the largest venue that a city had to offer, in their biggest theatre or public hall. But on other occasions, she would speak, she'd speak in people's parlors. She would speak even if there were just a few people that turned up. One occasion in Appleton, Wisconsin, only about 5 people turned up, but she still spoke for 2 hours and did her full lecture. So this required an enormous amount of energy, and in some ways was quite a transformative experience for her. She was away from her family at quite a distance for the first time, and really acting in a far more kind of independent way. I'm going to come back to those tours and what happened to her on those tours in a minute. But I want to say something about her return from the second tour in 1912. When Sylvia Pankhurst returned to Britain in 1912, she came back to a transformed political situation. When she got back, a truce that had been established between the militant suffragettes and the British government had completely broken down. The leaders of the campaign had launched a mass window smashing campaign to protest at the way the government had sabotaged a women's suffrage bill that was going through Parliament. And in response, the leadership of the campaign had been arrested. Her own mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, was facing potentially a very, very long prison sentence indeed, because private property is so sacred to the British state. You get a very long sentence if you incite attacks on private property. And her older sister, Christabel Pankhurst, to escape the same fate, had fled into exile in Paris. Now, what's interesting about this is at the moment when the stakes were dramatically raised, Sylvia Pankhurst breaks with her previous policy of being quiet about her disagreements with the leadership. And what she tries to do is take control of the militant suffragette campaign in Britain and redirect it. Because what she understands is that a fundamentally elitist strategy that was relying on smaller and smaller groups of quite privileged women inside society was going to be a completely ineffective way of challenging the British government. And instead, what she argued was there needed to be a mass campaign that involved the vast majority of people inside British society, and that therefore it had to be based on mobilizing working class women absolutely at its heart. And no longer could these women be pushed to the sidelines, but they had to be at the heart of the militant suffragette campaign. So what she does in 1912 is she goes to East London, then as now one of the poorest parts of London. She goes there with a friend of hers, a woman called Zaylee Emerson. And they went there, they established new branches of the Women's Social and Political Union, composed of working class women. And they began to organize mass campaigns. They began to organize big demonstrations. They made plans for a rent strike for women's suffrage, which would be something that working class women could do, because back then it was working women who paid the rent in working class households. As a result of doing that, at the beginning of 1914, Sylvia Pankhurst was expelled from the Women's Social and Political Union by her older sister, Christabel Pankhurst, and her organisation of those 6 branches in East London then forms the East London Federation of Suffragettes, which goes on to chart a very different direction from the Women's Social and Political Union. Whereas the Women's Social and Political Union supported the British state upon the outbreak of the First World War, the East London Federation of Suffragettes opposed it and tried to stop the war. They later supported adult suffrage. Sylvia Pankhurst supported the Bolshevik Revolution, and the East London Federation of Suffragettes becomes one of the forerunners of the Communist Party in Britain. Now, all of that after 1912 is quite a well-known story. But what I want to go back to is that moment when they begin to found this new organization. Because what's far less well-known is that while Sylvia Pankhurst is engaged in that activity of founding these new groups, of trying to redirect the militant suffragette organization in Britain, she was thinking about America. She was writing a book about America. And we know this because of something on the manuscript. This is one page of the manuscript of that book that she wrote about the United States. And I don't know if you can see, but about halfway down the typescript, she writes about something happening now. She's put a little, she's added that in her own writing. She's written now engaged, and then she's put a little star by the now, and at the bottom of the page that star relates to February 1913, she tells us. Now, in February 1913, Sylvia Pankhurst was very busy indeed. She was arrested on 3 separate occasions. on the final occasion that month, she was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment as a suffragette. She was sentenced to 2 months hard labor. And as a consequence of that, and not being recognized as a political prisoner, she and her friend Zaylee Emerson, who was arrested alongside her, that woman who helped her found the new campaign, both of them went on hunger strike. Sylvia Pankhurst escalated that activity to force the authorities to release her from prison. So she not only went on hunger strike, she went on a thirst strike and a rest strike as well, refusing even to rest, refusing to go to sleep, walking up and down her cell until she collapsed and terrified the authorities into releasing her. Zaylee Emerson escalated the action. She became very desperate in prison and tried to take her own life. She managed to get a penknife and she tried to cut through the artery on her wrist. She failed. She said it was like a rubber band and she couldn't cut it. But this was what was happening in February 1913. And I think that's a very important context. While Sylvia Pankhurst was doing that, she was thinking about the United States. And one of the questions I want to try and answer is why that was. In part, I think that's because of what was happening in the United States when she went, and because of the people that she met there. When Sylvia Pankhurst went to America in 1911, it was embroiled in a huge upsurge in class conflicts. And that class conflict in that period was led primarily by working class women, very many of them from immigrant backgrounds. And Sylvia Pankhurst comes into contact with that movement. It lasted from 1909 with an outbreak of garment workers' strikes in New York City, really up until 1915. Sylvia Pankhurst comes into contact with it in January 1911 when she goes to Chicago, where again there was an outbreak of strike action amongst garment workers. Most of them women, very many of them from immigrant backgrounds. The strike, the initial cause of the strike was a wage cut in the garment factories, but it was about far more than that. Here's a photograph from the strike, which really indicates what the strikers themselves felt was at stake. They've got a banner here that says, "We are striking for human treatments." And that's really what they felt this struggle was about. Not only had their wages been cut, those were poverty wages anyway. Those wages were subject to a whole system of punitive fines. Women could be fined for pretty much anything, including things like using too much soap when they washed their hands, because that belonged to the company. They were subject to abuse routinely at work from the foreman. The foreman had all of these targets and got a bonus if the women worked even faster and met those targets. And so in the autumn of 1910, these women walked out on strike, factory after factory. Their resistance was met by the kind of brutality that Sylvia Pankhurst would in some ways have recognized. It was met by police brutality. Women were batoned on the picket lines. Not only that, but if you were a woman garment worker who went on strike in America in this period, what you could expect, and what they did experience in Chicago, were your employer hiring thugs who would come down and break the bones of the women who dared to picket, as an attempt to try and intimidate them out of ever taking that kind of action ever again. And Sylvia Pankhurst encounters this right towards the end of a very bitter struggle that lasted many months. She encountered it because she was taken to the cells where those garment workers were imprisoned. And she was taken there by two women who were involved in the Women's Trade Union League, who supported these women's struggle. And one of those two women was Zaylee Emerson, who would return with Sylvia Pankhurst, or return separately, would return to join Sylvia Pankhurst in London in 1912 to help her found what became the East London Federation of Suffragettes. Now, it's not often when you discover as a historian a moment that everybody's forgotten about, which you argue is of very great historic importance, that there was somebody there to take a photograph of it. But in this instance, there was. And so there is a photograph of this meeting of Sylvia Pankhurst and Zaylee Emerson in Chicago, as Zaylee Emerson shows Sylvia Pankhurst just how hard that garment workers' struggle had been. And here they are. This is a photograph now held by the Chicago History Museum. And what you can see here is Sylvia Pankhurst looking into that cell where one of the garment workers had been held. And then there are three women behind her. The one furthest away from her, that is her friend, Zaylee Emerson. And I love the expressions of the men standing behind her, one of whom I think is sorely regretting this decision to take Sylvia Pankhurst to the cells. Now, this meeting is incredibly important. Zaylee Emerson had played a key role in the garment workers' strike. She herself was from a very privileged background indeed. She was very, very wealthy. But she decided to support working women in their struggle. And she played a leading role in a number of important ways. She was the so-called chairman of the Rent Committee. And this was a committee that basically coordinated a rent strike for the duration of the industrial strike, so that women wouldn't be put under pressure to pay the rent at the same time as they were taking industrial action. So Zaylee went around persuading the landlords in Chicago that they were going to have to accept not getting any rent for the whole duration of the strike. And what they also did is they understood that women, also being the providers of food in the home, were going to need a huge amount of support if this strike was to have any chance of success. And Zaylee was very deeply involved in the relief effort as well. So what she did was ensure that the strikers had enough food to eat and were kept warm. They were going on strike in these very bitterly cold winter months. This was a strike that involved around 40,000 women, so a huge number of women to support. But of course, it wasn't just confined to them. It also involved all of their family members as well. These women estimated they were supporting around 100,000 people. There were 1,250 babies born in the course of the strike to striking families, so they all needed to be supported as well. And coordinating this was a massive effort. It was a very multicultural workforce. The workers there spoke between them 9 different languages. That was also a challenge that needed to be overcome. It meant they had different dietary requirements. There were Jewish workers going on strike who needed kosher food, for example. Zaylee was involved in coordinating all of this. And learning about this had a huge effect on Sylvia Pankhurst. She wrote about it in the manuscript. She also wrote a letter to the press in Chicago, comparing the struggle of the suffragettes in Britain to the struggle of working class garment workers in Chicago, and relating their struggles. And as I said, it would be Zaylee who would make the decision that she was going to come and help Sylvia Pankhurst found a working class movement for women's political rights in Britain. But there is, I think, another reason that Sylvia Pankhurst was thinking about America in February 1912, as she's involved in developing the East London Federation. And the answer to that is to be found in what she writes about in her book. When she went to America, she found that in her descriptions of how terrible factory conditions were in Britain, how awful prison conditions were for suffragette prisoners, the level of police brutality. She found often that her audiences, who were mostly comprised of very wealthy women, Sylvia Pankhurst, who famously was not interested at all in elegant clothes and dresses and these kind of things, was told very often that she had to lecture wearing an evening dress, something very difficult to kind of keep ironed as she traveled on her own around the United States. But these were the kinds of people that she was speaking to. And she found that although they were very sympathetic and were prepared to accept that those abuses were happening in the old country, she was coming up against this attitude that the same would never be true in the United States. Very often she was being told by the press that women, there was no way that America would stand for women to be treated the same way, that in developed modern capitalist America, women barely needed to go out to work at all. And if they did, they were paid fantastic wages. And the only women who were having to endure poverty wages were new immigrants. And as soon as they basically became involved more deeply in American capitalism and assimilated, then they would be paid fabulous wages as well. And Sylvia Pankhurst understood that this argument was a threat to everything that she was fighting for, because the solution that was being posited in modern advanced capitalist America was not more democracy, but was more capitalism to improve women's lives. So what she decides to do is she decides to research this question while she's on tour, and to find out what American capitalism is really like. And to do this, she actually had to stand up to her hosts and quite often and insist that she wanted to tour the places where ordinary working class people were. So her book it's not about her. The book is about what life was like for women who worked in factories, because she went into factories and she interviewed the women there and she talked to them about their lives. And she talked to them about what it was like, for example, to work in a factory at a time when Taylorism, if people know what that is, it was this kind of scientific management of work that meant everybody did sort of small repetitive tasks to make production all the more efficient. She wrote about how soul destroying that kind of work was. She went into prisons and spoke to prisoners. She went to a college for Native American students and spoke to them about the destruction of their culture that the college was basically propagating. And then in the last very harrowing and very haunting chapter of the book that she wrote, the final chapter, she writes about going into prisons in the South, in the southern states. She went to Tennessee and she went into the prisons in Nashville. And she writes in a very haunting way about racist oppression in Nashville and what that meant for Black prisoners who were being framed by racist police officers, and also the violence in those prisons. And all of this found its way into her speeches when she spoke to these polite audiences in the United States. And this really did mean standing up to her hosts. One of the things that she did, when she went to the South, it's sort of important to put this in context. What she found was the suffragists in the South were making explicitly racist arguments for women's suffrage, and what they were doing was trying to persuade lawmakers to grant the vote on the basis that women's suffrage would be a good way to combat the votes of Black men. So thereby positioning women's suffrage as something that would enhance and bolster white supremacy, and of course completely writing out of the picture any question of the suffrage for Black women. When Sylvia's in the South, she receives an invitation to go and speak at Fisk University, which was a college for Black students. And she was told by her host that there was no way that she could accept this invitation, which of course would have undermined the kind of racist arguments that they were making. And she refused to go along with that. She went to Fisk and she spoke, but she also listened when she went there. She listened to what the students there were telling her, and that finds its way into the final chapter as well. And she incorporates these experiences into her speeches. And what she argues is that women's inferior status, which was embodied in their lack of political rights, their lack of a right to vote, meant that employers understood they could pay them far less than their male counterparts. And that therefore, far from being marginal to American capitalism and not needing to work at all, in fact, women's low-paid, sweated labor was becoming more and more central to American capitalism because it could realize greater and greater profits. And therefore the vote was not less important in the United States, but was just as important or even more important to campaign for. The terrible cost of being voiceless, of not having a vote, the terrible cost of powerlessness was revealed to Sylvia Pankhurst by an event that happened while she was touring the United States in 1911. It happened at a factory called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. That's a factory that makes women's blouses. It was in New York City. And this factory had been one of those that started that big strike wave in 1909, which Pankhurst encountered in Chicago 2 years later. They won quite a few of their demands, but they didn't win at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory union recognition. This factory was on the top 3 floors of the Ash building in Greenwich Village. It's still there in Manhattan in New York City. It's on the top floors, which are too high for the ladders of fire departments to reach. There were regulations that factories had to abide by at this time. And those regulations said that the doors on factory floors shouldn't be locked, so that if there was an emergency, workers could escape. But without a recognized union, workers were powerless to get those regulations enforced. And the doors at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were routinely locked on the factory floor. They were locked because the employers didn't want their workers stealing anything from them, taking unauthorized breaks, things like that. And on the 25th of March, 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and the workers found themselves trapped. And 146 workers, most of them women, most of them immigrants, were burnt to death or died trying to flee the flames, jumping from the windows. This happens while Sylvia Pankhurst is touring in America, and she went to the funeral procession. She went and to the funeral of the victims of the fire in New York. Here's a photograph of that funeral procession. This had a profound effect on Sylvia Pankhurst, and she wrote about this in the preface to her unpublished book. And it's this that I'd like to read from as the final part of this talk, to give you a sense of this book. So this is Sylvia Pankhurst writing about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and the funeral that she attended, which she felt was important to mention in the preface to this book. So here's Sylvia's writing. But even as it is today, how wonderful is New York from some high place at twilight, when the lofty buildings of commerce are fading into obscurity and one sees not their great walls, faint and shadowy, but their thousand windows like jewels of fire. Their golden patterning and the blue fading light cast a compelling glamour over this city of substantial and materialistic trade. It becomes ethereal as a city of dreams, beautiful and calm as the home of supermen. Seeing the city thus, it is strange to remember it on a sad day of mourning, when rain poured from a grey sky, and a long procession of saddened work girls marched in their poor black garments to show honour and respect to their comrades, burnt to death in an awful fire. A fire that was fatal because ordinary means of exit were inadequate. Fire escapes were too short to reach the factory's monstrous heights, and when the girls sprang from the roof, their tender bodies came hurtling down with an impelling force that tore the sheets held out for them to shreds. As one travels over that vast continent of America, teeming with wondrous natural resources, with endless possibilities of new growth, one sees, as in our older and more crowded land, everywhere the cruel waste of precious human energy and the crushing out of fragile, tender things. One sees, perhaps more clearly than in any other country, new ideals of civilization striving with the old, the sharp, impersonal, pitiless commercial enterprise that everywhere crushes out the slothful inexactitudes and rough, spasmodic kindlinesses and brutalities of the past, and would, in its turn, make the human beings that it uses ever more machine-like. One now sees faced with the new upspringing of public thought and action that shall place higher than all else the happiness and development of human lives. It is because the things with which they deal are symptomatic of growth from the waste and hardship of the old, ill-regulated past to the splendid hopes and promises of the future that these chapters have been written. And I think in that beautiful description of New York, we get encapsulated Sylvia Pankhurst's approach to the United States, which was in part how much it inspired her. She goes to this country that is so vast, that is so full of resources, that is such a break from stuffy, traditional Britain. But on the other hand, she sees that all of that energy is organized around profit, around something completely inhuman. And the conclusion that she draws ever more strongly from this is that there can be no sense in which these struggles can wait or rely upon other people to achieve their emancipation for them, as was being argued in Britain by her mother and her older sister. There was no sense in saying more privileged people could fight the battle for working class people on their behalf. On the contrary, working class people needed to seize their own emancipation with their own hands. That was a revolutionary idea, and that was an idea that she brought back and with which she changed the suffragette movement forever.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for that excellent talk. I'm very pleased you read that lyrical passage, which in reading it in the preface to Sylvia's writings, it was interesting, certainly, and well worth reading. I could also very much recommend the book because, as well as the actual letters of Sylvia Pankhurst, Kate has done this really impressive introduction and commentary, an overall introduction and commentary, but also an introduction to each of Sylvia's chapters, which was really got very impressive in terms of the amount of research that's actually gone into that, because it's material that, as far as I'm aware, has not been published or used elsewhere. So over to questions and discussion. Before I ask people to put their hands up or wave or put messages in the chat, just to say that this is being recorded, just to warn you of that. I should have said that at the beginning, but Kate knew we were doing that, and now you all know. So who wants to ask the first question? I'm just looking for hands up. Right, I've got Sean Creighton first. Sean, remember to unmute yourself when I call you to speak.
Sorry.
No, you just muted yourself again. That should be okay.
Okay, that was a really great talk. Couple of things arise from it. You talked about her attendance at and talking to the students at Fisk University. Did she meet, and is there anything in the writings about other African American activists that she got to speak to, and if so, who they were, given the many connections across the Atlantic between African American activists and British and other activists, particularly with African heritage in Britain. And I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, Kate, if you want to respond, you're appearing sideways, by the way. I don't know whether that's intentional. Yeah, that's you're the right way up now.
Catherine's muted.
You need to unmute yourself. So I shouldn't have confused you by commenting on your video. You should be okay now. Oh no, you've muted yourself again.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to explain what happened, which is that my broadband just failed a minute ago.
Okay.
So hopefully it won't again. But yes, I had to kind of log in on my phone, and I'm now back on my laptop. So hopefully this will continue to go okay.
Did you hear Sean's question?
I only got the end of it. Would you mind just sort of asking it again? I'm really sorry.
I can't unmute now.
No, you were unmute yourself again.
Yeah, sorry, I was just saying what a great lecture that was, but the question I wanted to follow up on was, you talked about her going to speaking to the students at Fisk University. Is there any detail in what she wrote about meeting other African-American activists, particularly given the cross-Atlantic connections into Britain with activists in Britain? And if so, can you indicate some of the people that she also spoke to, please?
Yeah, sure. No, it's something that I'm really interested to find out, and we don't really know the whole story of Sylvia's tours still. I've managed to kind of recreate a timeline of them, which is the first time that's happened. But no, I don't think she met that many African-American activists, although she did make that stance of going to Fisk. Later, of course, she corresponds with Du Bois, and she mentions to him, oh, I went to Fisk, and talks about that, but that's much later in her life. So no, I'm not aware of, because there were a whole number of activists, African-American suffragists. I'm not aware of any that she definitely was in contact with. But we do know that quite a few of the women activists that she was in contact with were themselves involved in organizations that involve both Black and white suffragists. So yeah, I mean, it's a really intriguing question, and we don't fully know the answer, but I don't know of any kind of famous figures that she was able to connect with from the African-American community.
Okay, Mads Peterson next.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Mads Peterson. I'm from the Danish Labor Society for Labor History in Copenhagen, and thank you for the lecture. A question. My question is, do you have any information about how did she finance her tours, and who did she work with organizing it? I mean, the vastness of her lecture tours, and she was traveling on her own. It must have taken somebody to cooperate with and to organize all that. Question one about finance, and what did she live from? I mean, it's not very profitable to be a speaker and a suffragette. I mean, what kind of financial foundation was under her life in all this? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you so much for it. And the two are connected. So going on a tour of the United States was a way for suffragettes to earn money, going on lecture tours. So these were organized by professional lecturing agencies, which existed in the States. And so that's why she had that beautiful kind of glossy brochure. They kind of organized it, and then she would be paid lecturing fees. And that money allowed her then to go back and be a full-time activist in East London. So again, there's that kind of material connection there. She was an artist and a journalist, and that's how she was kind of making her money. So in the States, you know, she was also kind of writing as well. And yeah, so those things are very much connected.
Thank you. Mary Rowland next.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks very much. Very interesting. Apologies, I haven't read your book. I'm in France, and getting books over here at the moment is interesting. My question is there any link, do you think, between Sylvia going to America and Adele going to, when Adele went to Australia, she founded the Communist Party of Australia. And I think it's fascinating. It just occurred to me listening to your talk. Well, Sylvia went to America and Adele went to Australia. We know the circumstances about why she went to Australia, but she did end up co-founding the Communist Party of Australia. And I think, did Sylvia and Adele have a strategy, do you think? Does she refer to Adele and say, we decided I'd go to America and she'd go and sort out the Aussies and, you know, radicalize them all?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. No, not really. And in a way, it's one of those questions about, well, what would have happened if Sylvia and Adela, certainly before, you know, because Adela in that period, of course, was very radical. She later gets involved in fascist movements in Australia. But in this period, she's much more in the kind of socialist wing of the suffrage movement. And as you say, later with communism, but they don't really link up together, Sylvia and Adela. But there is a link, I think, in that both of them are kind of sent to these places. You know, Adela is sent by her mother and older sister to get her out of the way and to ensure that she ceases to be in any way kind of a figurehead in the suffragette movement. And the same is done with Sylvia Pankhurst. They were very determined that these kind of socialist members of the family wouldn't become figureheads. So these were kind of strategies to export them for a little while. With Adela, it's for life. For Sylvia, it's for, you know, 3 months and then 3 months, but it backfires spectacularly with Sylvia, precisely because of what she brings back.
Thanks. Steve Cushion.
Yeah, in terms of the African-American connection, of course, she ended up working with Claude Mackay later. Yeah. I don't know if there's any connection. I mean, there was a war in between these incidents and so on. But what I was thinking of was, of course, this period in the United States is the heyday of the IWW, of the Wobblies. And, you know, 1912 was the Lawrence strike and so on. And one has this wonderful idea that she might have met Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. I don't suppose she did, but that's so it. And given her kind of later politics, I really do see a sort of a similarity with some of the political positions of the IWW at this time. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. And I see also that Virginia's put in the chat about Claude Mackay, who's so important and makes such an important contribution to her newspaper, her communist newspaper, immediately after the First World War. Whether they connected in America, I don't know, but we do know that Sylvia was reading his poetry, which she published in the Dreadnought before she met him in person. His poetry was published by, amongst others, Max Eastman. And we know that Sylvia met Max Eastman in the US. So there are kind of tantalizing links. On the question of the IWW and the Lawrence strike, yes, Sylvia meets Elizabeth Gurley Flynn at the beginning of 1912. One thing I should say, I said her tours were organized by professional agencies, and that's true. The first one was quite a slick tour. It went quite well. The agency ensured that she was in all these big venues. The second one, she'd been over once before. Her mother had been over twice. There was a little less interest, and she got very frustrated with the agency that they hadn't organized that much. It's 1912 when she really starts to organize her own tour and decides that she wants to go to Milwaukee because socialists have been elected to the local government, that she wants to go to Tennessee and see what's happening there. A day after stepping off the boat in 1912, she speaks at a laundry workers' strike on the same platform as Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in Harlem, at the Harlem Arcade. And yeah, I think you're right, Steve. Her political positions later on in life are very kind of close to those of the IWW, particularly in her kind of disillusionment in Parliament and using parliamentary politics as a strategy for communists. But in this period, actually, because she's agitating for the right to vote, that connection isn't there so much. It does come later. At this point, she and Keir Hardie, who was her lover, her comrade, and who himself had been to the United States on lecture tours, both of them were kind of arguing against a kind of overlooking of Parliament, really, because they saw it as a crucial battleground in this period, and she's campaigning for the right to vote. So there's not really a kind of seeing eye to eye. What she's trying to do is, in this period, is link up economic questions and women's economic position with the need for political power and representation.
Okay, thanks. Just one comment from me while I'm sort of waiting for the next question, because I'm looking to other people to ask questions. I don't know whether anybody else has come across it yet, but there's a new volume published, co-edited by Neville Kirk, called Workers of the Empire Unite, which has actually got a very good essay in it on the workers' dreadnought, including Claude Mackay's involvement in that. And it's basically a study of Sylvia Pankhurst's use of the journal for an anti-colonialist position, which genuinely she's regarded as only taking up later in the 20s, well, in the late 20s and early 30s in the Ethiopian campaign. But this demonstrates the degree of anti-colonialism much, much earlier on, and her links obviously to the Communist Party at that time. I was also really going to ask Katherine a bit more about sort of the fact that the letters were written to Keir Hardie, or most of them were, and whether really either the influence that Keir Hardie had on Sylvia Pankhurst, but possibly more significantly, the influence Sylvia Pankhurst had on Keir Hardie, because this is the last couple of years of Keir Hardie's life. So I don't know whether you want to comment further on that.
Yeah, sure. So the book and the manuscript was based on letters that she sent back to Keir Hardie, who was her lover. This was difficult for both of them because because he was married, and also because her family were the way they were directing the suffrage campaign was increasingly targeting the Labour Party, and he was a Labour MP and a socialist, of course. So she was writing these letters back to him, and it's on those that she bases the book. Something that I found out since writing this, and which is going to be which I've published on, it's going to come out quite soon, is that she was also sending articles back for his newspaper, The Pioneer, which was published in Merthyr Tydfil, his constituency. So some of the articles, so for example, the chapter on the Native American College, that first appeared in a socialist newspaper in South Wales. And those then later become the chapters of this book. So absolutely, this book comes out of a dialogue between socialists. And I think one of the kind of ways we can see the influence of that relationship between the two of them is she's trying to grapple with the relationship between the struggle for working class emancipation, but at the same time recognizing the need for a struggle for women's rights, because she's trying to marry the two together at a time when her mother and older sister are trying to separate them, but also, you know, a whole number of figures in the socialist movement were trying to separate them as well. And both Hardie and Pankhurst were trying to kind of understand how those could fruitfully cooperate, and why they could. And that's very much what she writes about when she goes to Milwaukee and she sees the socialist administration there, and she really kind of mourns the way that this administration, their attitude to women's suffrage is not important, that, you know, this is something to come later. Socialism will just, how electing socialists will automatically be great for women. And she's got a really fantastic critique, not just of that, but also, which I think is incredibly relevant, this idea that if you just elect the right people, that progressive change automatically follows. And she talks about the way in which vested interests intervene, and it's not just about electing the right people. So that's where this book comes out of. It comes out of that dialogue between the two of them, which is quite exciting. Did that answer your question?
It did, to a certain extent, yes. I think that's useful. Mary, you still got your hand up. I don't know whether you wanted to comment further. No, okay. I can't see any other hands up yet. I'm sure other people have got questions. Surely. There's a lot there. Sean again. We should be able to hear you, Sean.
Yeah, right, yeah. Following up on what Steve talked about, the IWW, of course, this is the period of the syndicalist movement in Britain and Tom Mann's particular role in it. Is there much evidence of them being in dialogue when he gets back from, where is it, Australia?
Yeah, I think probably
simple as that.
Yes, no, certainly she did know Tom Mann, but probably her sort of strongest contacts with the syndicalists are in Ireland. And, you know, and again, this relates to the question of her anti-colonialism, which, as people here have rightly said, wasn't just something that happened in the 1920s. This is a integral part of her socialism. And, you know, after all, it is Sylvia Pankhurst's decision to stand in solidarity with the locked out Dublin workers in 1913, led by the syndicalist James Larkin. She stands on he's been arrested at this point, so she's standing on the platform alongside James Connelly on the Albert Hall. It was her decision to do that sees her being expelled from the Women's Social and Political Union. That was kind of the final straw. And so, yes, she was very, she was sympathetic to those ideas and very interested in them. But really in this period as well, she's trying to marry that with a strategy to win political rights, and trying to understand how working class militancy can be utilized to win political rights as well. Whereas, a lot in the suffragette movements, a lot of the kind of more elitist leadership were trying to counterpose the two. They were saying things like, well, men have got the right to vote. And of course, that wasn't true of all men in this period, but they were saying men have got the right to vote, so they shouldn't take any other political action other than voting. So they shouldn't even go on strike, they shouldn't protest. And Sylvia Pankhurst completely rejects that kind of approach, but she does want to see collective action and working class militancy also support a political struggle as well. She's interested in that interaction, certainly in this period.
Okay, anybody else? Come on, somebody else must have a question. I see we've got people from various parts of the world here. So somebody said hello from Edmonton in Canada. So anybody else? Right. Do you want to say anything to round us off, Katherine?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me. And perhaps the final thing that I'd like to say is just how relevant I feel these ideas are right now. I think what's important about the manuscript that she was writing, I think there's a whole number of things that are important about it, but what strikes me is that there's a real defense of socialism from below in that, and I'm not the first person to point that out by any means. It's a phrase that Les Garner uses when he's writing about Sylvia Pankhurst, but you see it throughout this manuscript, and it really is extraordinary in terms of the voices that come through that manuscript, the voices of immigrant women workers, the voices of Native Americans, the voices of Black prisoners in Nashville. And so it's an extraordinary piece of writing, which I think sheds light and changes our view of why things changed in the suffragette movement, in the militant campaign in 1912, and the kind of conclusions that Pankhurst was drawing there. But also, I think, right at the moment, we're seeing a dialogue, a transatlantic dialogue going on, particularly about things like Black Lives Matter, for example, where, protests in the United States inspired protests in Britain precisely because people identified that the same oppressions are taking place here, and the same issues are relevant here, and the same oppressions need to be combated here. And I think this is a real genuine internationalism, and it's a tradition that Sylvia Pankhurst very much stood in. I think very often we're kind of sold an internationalism that's from above, for example, that's just about governments cooperating with each other, and I think it's very important to kind of counter that. That's not internationalism. It's certainly not the internationalism that has anything to do with socialism. And I think remembering the importance of these kinds of tours that people like Sylvia Pankhurst and many other socialists besides undertook and the kind of discussions they wanted to take place about what was happening in the United States, about what was happening in Britain, that cross-fertilization of ideas, that practical solidarity that they were trying to bring. I think that is that's real internationalism, and it's brave, and it meant people like Pankhurst taking courageous and difficult decisions, and showing what side they were on. But I think the consequences of that were enormously far-reaching in Britain, and it really did change the struggle in Britain. But I think it's a lesson that's really relevant for us as well today in our efforts to try and change the world.
Thank you very much, and thank you for drawing that relevance to our attention. Just a couple of things. I mean, I noticed somebody's put in the chat, did Sylvia Pankhurst meet Eugene Debs? But if you refer to page 109 of the book, you will discover that Emil Seidel, the socialist mayor of Milwaukee, actually was the vice presidential candidate for the Socialist Party when Eugene Debs stood for president in the 1912 presidential election. And the two of them got over 1 million votes, which, if only socialists could get over 1 million votes in America now, or multiply it by the growth of population, would be quite helpful. But we can only hope and argue, I suppose. Okay, just a couple of things about the Socialist History Society, our organization. If you aren't a member, do join us. You can also look for details on how to join us on our website, which is www.socialisthhistorysociety.co.uk. For joining the society, you actually get a newsletter a couple of times a year. You also get a couple of occasional publications, and also our academic journal, the Socialist History Journal. And Steve Cushion has just put the link to the website up on the shared on the screen. In terms of our next two events, we're organizing quite a lot at the moment. Interestingly, now we're on Zoom, we seem to be getting a lot more people, so we decided it's worth organizing more meetings. So the next meeting we've got is Saturday, the 24th of April, 2 p.m. You can see the details there. Hotspots and Hinterlands, a local history of Britain's war resistors during the First World War by Cyril Pearce, who has written a book. You can see reference there, Communities of Resistance. And the following meeting is, that one, as I say, is 2 p.m. Saturday the 24th. The following one is Saturday the 29th of May, 6:30, Writers of the Left in an Age of Extremes. And that's to launch our latest occasional publication. And that's Writers of the Left in an Age of Extremes, on Edgell Rickword, Anna Segers and Carlo Levi. And that publication is back from the printers and on its way to you very soon, I understand. It may even have arrived in a few people's letterboxes. We've got a couple of other occasional publications being finalized for publication later in the year. So do join. I mean, what we're also hoping that more members of the society will write articles and reviews for the newsletter, but we're also asking members and others to tell us what they're doing. What research are you undertaking? Do you want to make contact with people on your research area? What have you published? Because we really want to use the newsletter as a membership activity as a whole, rather than just for the publications of the committee members, which are quite prodigious, but are a little bit, we don't want to be seen as a little clique. We need to promote a lot more about what other people are doing. So any other sort of comments from my fellow committee members here? Anything you want to add, David or Steve or anybody else? No, okay. So unless anybody wants to make a final comment, thanks everybody, and see you, hopefully many of you, on the Zoom on the 24th of April. Bye.
Bye-bye all. Thanks, Katherine. That was lovely.
Got a few thumbs up showing there. Other logos appearing or icons.